What's up, Green Bay Packers fans? Welcome back. And as always, thank you for joining me. My name's Paul Brettel, and we are here. It is the final week of training camp. The Packers have 3 practices before they have their final preseason game on Saturday against the Seattle Seahawks at Lambeau Field. And so I'm going to talk about my 12 players who it is a really big week for in terms of making one last push to hopefully making that final 53-man roster. But first, as always, hit like on the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. I do greatly appreciate it. You can follow me over on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. You can find all my work over at Packers Wire. So now let's dive on in. As we all know, rosters are at 90 players and have been since the start of offseason programs for the most part. Final rosters, so cutting down to 53 players, has to be completed by Tuesday, August 29th. So a week from today, if you're watching this video on Tuesday. And with that, like I said, it's an important week for a number of players, but these 12 in particular have put themselves in position or in a few instances out of position in terms of making the final roster. So let's go through each of these position groups and talk about who has or who needs a big week upcoming. First one, we're starting with running back. And really, it's Patrick Taylor. All eyes are on him, at least for me anyways, in terms of that third running back. I know Emmanuel Wilson has looked really good with the ball in his hands, but Matt LaFleur, Brian Gutekunst, they've given us the answers to the test. They've told us what they are looking for in that third running back. It's special teams, it's blocking ability. Basically, everything except being a ball carrier. Now, of course, there's a certain prerequisite that each player has to have in that regard, but as the third running back with Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon taking pretty much all of the carries every week, all of the touches every week, if the third running back's going to contribute, it has to be on special teams. And that's really where Patrick Taylor has been able to stand out in that running back room. He played 121 special team snaps last season. He was the 4th highest graded Packer on special teams in 2022 as well. He's been on a number of starting special teams units in these preseason games, and he's held up really well as a blocker. If you've followed along with any of my training camp recap videos from the practices, just last week alone in the 2-minute drill against New England in one of the joint practices, there were 2 really nice blitz pickups that he had. In one of the other practices with New England, Packers are running a lot of 21 personnel or 2 running back sets. And he was out there on back-to-back plays, once with Jones, once with Dillon, and was the lead blocker for each of them. Did really good at getting to the second level and taking on a linebacker to help create some additional running room for each of them. Patrick Taylor is the third running back on this team. The question, however, is do the Packers roster just 2 running backs, which we saw them do initially last season. I came out with a roster prediction. You can find that over at Packers Wire, and I did have Taylor on there as the third. Reason being, as we've talked about, Packers have run a lot of 2 running back sets in training camp so far. And also, while there's flexibility with the practice squad rules, a player can be elevated up to game day up to 3 times. However, before or after that third time, the player then has to either be signed to the 53-man roster or they have to be released where they have the opportunity to sign elsewhere. Now, they could come back after that point, but again, if you're the Packers and you're releasing Patrick Taylor, for example, after his third elevation, you do risk him signing elsewhere. So over the course of the season, unless they just plan to go through various running backs every couple games, the Packers are probably going to need Patrick Taylor at some point on this 53-man roster. That's why I ended up putting him on the roster that I had put together at this point based on what we've seen. But like I said, he's running back 3. It's just a matter of, on the initial roster, do the Packers keep 2 or 3? That's really the big question right now. And he's going to need another strong week as he has leading up to earn that roster spot. Next up is the wide receiver position, Malik Heath and Grant DuBose. As far as Malik Heath goes, it really seems like he's done just about everything that he could to earn a roster spot. And it's also not as if, he's had some nice performances in the preseason games, but it's also not as if he's come out of nowhere either. He's been making plays going back to rookie minicamp, going back to OTAs, at the practices that were open to the media for us to view. I mean, he has just found ways the ball has been a magnet for him. He's just found ways. He's not the super fast Christian Watson or Jaden Reed, but he knows how to create separation, and he's shown that he can make complete catches that are contested as well. On top of that, and other important aspects, just like with running back, of course, there has to be a certain prerequisite for abilities as a pass catcher. But as the sixth receiver on this team, you know, that player's role is going to be small on offense, especially with how active the running backs are in the passing game, how active the tight ends are in the passing game. Wide receiver six may actually be like the 10th pass catching option in this offense. So they're going to have to show value as a blocker, which Malik Heath absolutely has. And then special teams against Cincinnati, he played just one special team snap. Against in their most recent game with New England, he was playing 6 and doing so on a variety of phases. So that was a very important development, at least for me, in terms of his ability to make this final roster. But he has absolutely put himself in position to do so. Grant DuBose, coming off an injury, missed all of rookie minicamp, all of offseason programs, just returned to practice 2 weeks ago, and just returned to team drills in this last week. Obviously has a very short window to earn a roster spot, but in the limited time he had, he's done a nice job. And in a couple of the practices, he's been able to string together sometimes 2, even 3 catches, had a solid performance against New England in the preseason game. And again, he's someone who has shown a blocking ability. He's willing to stick his nose in there and make those plays and handle those responsibilities. I remember during OTAs, Jason Vrabel, the Packers wide receiver coach, said when they were evaluating DuBose coming out of Charlotte before the draft, one of the players that stuck out to Vrabel in comparison to DuBose was Allen Lazard, because of his just willingness to do that blocking, do some of that dirty work that we know the Packers really covet at the receiver position. And DuBose was also playing 4 special team snaps, or he played 4 special team snaps as well in the New England preseason game, which was his first of this summer. So if you watch these videos before, you've probably heard me talk about how I think, or thought I should say, especially early on in training camp, that keeping 5 receivers was very much in play for the Packers. And again, it's for the reasons mentioned. A lot of 2 tight end, 2 running back sets. The 6th receiver is not going to have any sort of significant role. They may not have any role within the offense as long as everyone stays healthy. But now the pendulum is swung, and I very much feel that keeping 7 wide receivers is in play for the Packers with what Heath and DuBose have shown ability-wise to be able to do across, handling different responsibilities. But again, one more week to go, another preseason game to go, a big week for them. On the offensive line, I think it's a really important week for Sean Ryan, Royce Newman, and Jake Hansen. Although Jake Hansen did leave the New England game with a shin injury, haven't had any sort of update on what his availability is and if he's going to be back at practice or anything along those lines. So something to keep our eyes on. But as we're putting together or trying to guess how the Packers are going to put together this offensive line room, we know pretty much 7 spots are accounted for right now. There's Bakhtiari, Elton Jenkins, Josh Myers, John Runyon, Zach Tom, Yash Nyman, and especially over the last week, 2 weeks, we can add Rasheed Walker, who was started at left tackle for the Packers in the preseason game. Matt LaFleur said he had a really good week of practice, so we can add him to that mix as well of roster locks. I think Caleb Jones is going to be on the initial roster as well. The Packers brought in, so Caleb Jones, let me rewind. Caleb Jones was injured, suffered an ankle injury in the Cincinnati game. A few days later, the Packers brought in 5 players for workouts, 3 of which were offensive tackles. They did not sign any of those offensive tackles. So I do wonder if that's for Jones anyways, a good sign that his injury is not going to keep him out very long. Since the Packers didn't feel that they needed that additional depth at the tackle position to help get through training camp. During practices last week, it's also not as if he was nowhere to be found either. He was on the sidelines during the practices, going through individual stuff, working with the trainer. So hopefully he's back on the field sooner than later. And also, if it is more of a longer-term injury, the Packers could put him on the initial 53-man roster right away and then move him to IR. The reason that they would go that strategy is because if you put a player on IR before the official 53-man rosters are set, their season's over. They cannot come back. However, if they go on to the initial 53-man roster, are then moved to IR, they then have the option to come back after the initial 6 weeks, I believe it is, that they have to be out at a minimum. So that's something to keep our eyes on from an injury standpoint with him. But the Packers really, really like Jones. They rostered him all last season. even as the 11th offensive lineman, which is going very heavy at the position. He's been the right tackle with the second team offensive line for all of OTAs, all of training camp as well, up until his injury here. So I do feel that they really like him. So if the Packers keep 9 offensive linemen, which is most commonly what they do on the initial roster, that leaves one spot left for Ryan, Newman, and Hansen if he's available and healthy. All 3 of these guys had a really nice performance. The offensive line as a whole was very, very good against New England. Pro Football Focus didn't credit any member of the offensive line with giving up a single pressure in that game. It was really nice to see Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon having some solid running lanes because, as I've talked about on here before, running between the tackles in training camp, it's been tough sledding at times. So it was good to see them have some running lanes. If I were to guess right now of those 3, Ryan, Newman, Hansen, who the favorite is, I would guess it's Ryan because throughout training camp, he's been the most steady of the bunch. Again, they all played well against New England, but he's been the most consistent. He's also, to a degree, has more of the unknown as well, which is in terms of, it feels like at this point, the Packers know what they have in Royce Newman, good, bad, or indifferent. They know what they have in Jake Hansen, good, bad, or indifferent. Ryan, however, although he's coming off a tough rookie season, is a second-year, third-round pick with maybe some more upside than the other guys have. So if I were to guess, that's how I would guess that the Packers are leaning right now. But again, it's a big week for all 3, and who knows, maybe they end up keeping a 10th offensive lineman where 2 of those guys are kept instead of just 1. Switching to the defensive side of the ball, Jonathan Ford on the interior defensive line. I've talked about him on a few times here. From a roster standpoint, he's not really competing with anyone other than the big question is, do the Packers keep 5 interior defensive linemen or do they keep Jonathan Ford as the 6th? There's no one that he's competing with for that 6th spot. He has separated himself very much in that regard. So let's start with, why would the Packers only keep 5 interior defensive linemen? For one, a 6-man rotation, you just don't really see that much on your interior defensive line. Ford's role would be very, very small in this defense, maybe 5, maybe 10 snaps, a game. And again, that might be on the high side. So in terms of using a roster spot, well, it might make sense to have that spot going to a different position group than going to Jonathan Ford. On top of that, his role in this defense is going to be as a run defender, a run stuffer, which again, they need assistance with, but his role is so small already. If the Packers find themselves in these, must get stops on running down situations, it's going to be TJ Slayton. It's going to be Kenny Clark out there. It's going to be Devontae Wyatt. Like, they're going to use the top of the depth chart guys on those rushing downs and those must-have it situations. So again, even when his skill set could be most beneficial, I'm still not sure how often he's going to see the field. Now, the other side of that, why would they keep Jonathan Ford? Well, they did all of his rookie season. He's a 7th-round pick. They kept him on the roster as a 6th interior defender, even though he was inactive for every game last season. He never suited up on Sundays. In addition to that, he's just been really good. He's been doing a very good job at generating push up the middle. Like I said, this Packers defensive front, specifically along the defensive line, they have a ton of pass rush options, but they don't necessarily, or there's unknowns, I should say, when it comes to who's going to be the ones to step up along with Slayton, along with Clark in the run defense. And he's someone that, again, has shown the ability to in the preseason, even though not sure how big his role is going to be. So Ford, he's going to have to continue playing at the level that he has up to this point, but very much in contention for a roster spot as that 6th interior defender. Jump into the edge rusher position. Really, it's Brenton Cox. Again, it's a numbers game. Do the Packers keep 5 edge rushers, which is pretty common? There are even times last season when Rashawn Gary was injured and they had other injuries where they went into Sundays with only 4. Or do they keep Cox as a 6, which is going very heavy? If you're going with 6 edge rushers, you're going light elsewhere. Maybe it's 2 running backs. Maybe it's 6 receivers. Maybe it's 3 tight ends. Like, you're going to have to go light elsewhere if you're going with 6 edge rushers. With that said, really since the Cincinnati game, Cox has flipped a switch and turned things on. I remember writing before that first preseason game that at that time, he hadn't really flashed at all during training camp. He was playing with a 3rd-team defense and just wasn't generating many of those wow plays. And if he did, it certainly wasn't consistently. However, like I said, from the Bengals game on, In that game, he led the Packers in pressures. He carried that over into last week's performance against the Patriots, doing a good job getting into the backfield. And at this point, I don't see the Packers releasing Justin Hollins in an effort to keep Brenton Cox instead. Hollins has consistently been playing with the first team defense. He's taken on a few starting roles on special teams as well. I mean, during his time here with Green Bay last season, when he was claimed off waivers, made an immediate impact against the run, immediate impact against the pass. So, like I said before, from a cap standpoint, salary cap standpoint, Justin Hollins is not a lock. There's very little dead cap if the Packers release him, but based on how they're using him, very much feels like he's going to be on this roster. So do the Packers keep a sixth edge rusher in Cox? And the comparison that I've made previously with Cox is to Caleb Jones. Like I said, last year, he was a 2022 undrafted rookie. Cox is a 2023 undrafted rookie. Packers really liked Jones and the potential that he showed. So they rostered him, basically had a redshirt year because they didn't want to put him on the practice squad where potentially another team could have signed Jones away. I could very much see them taking a similar approach at edge rusher with Cox, putting him on the roster, again, to develop and to make sure that he's not on the practice squad where another team could sign him. At linebacker, I'm keeping my eye on Tariq Carpenter and Eric Wilson. I'll start with Wilson. I've been very impressed with his play, both on defense. He's been the fourth linebacker behind McDuffie, Quay Walker, and Devondre Campbell. He's been with the second unit pretty much all summer. During the second joint practice against New England, had two really nice pass deflections that popped up in the air and were intercepted by the Packers defense. He was used as a blitzer in the 2-minute drill that same day, got in the quarterback's face right away, forced him to throw the ball away. So I've been impressed with Wilson. He's also a core special teams player. He was actually PFF's highest graded special teams player all of last season across the entire NFL. That's where he spent most of his career. That's where his value is going to be felt the most. So for all the reasons just mentioned, probably doesn't make sense to release him, especially since the Packers have already lost in Tyler Davis, a very versatile, do-it-all veteran special teams player in him, a role that Wilson has also filled in 2022. But where the Packers potentially could or see the reason to move on from Wilson is if they feel there's a roster crunch. Again, they keep Brenton Cox as a sixth edge rusher. Maybe they keep a seventh receiver, so that means you're going to have to go light at other positions. And when you're looking at Wilson, who's a veteran, in his, I think he's 27, 28 years old on a 1-year deal, and the Packers are in a transition year. If you're looking at keeping him over Tariq Carpenter, for example, who's only in his second season, he's still on his rookie deal, he's making a transition to a new position. You hope that there's some developmental upside there. Given where this Packers team is currently, it probably makes more sense to go with the younger player and take a swing with that upside on the back end of your roster, again, rather than the veteran. So to me, that's the one instance where if the Packers do move on from Wilson when they're making their final roster cuts, that's going to be the reason why. But with that said, Tariq Carpenter, he's going through a position change, but he's really experiencing a learning curve there. And also from a special team standpoint, I'm not sure how much to read into this, but he went from playing 14 snaps against Cincinnati to just 4 special team snaps against New England. And defensively, he's getting outsnapped by a wide margin by undrafted rookie Jimmy Phillips. So he's struggling on defense. His special teams role was diminished. And again, maybe that's because the Packers are like, he's on the team. We already know that. Let's just get a look at some other guys. Carpenter also missed a few days of practice last week, so maybe that had a factor in it as well. It's we're just trying to, connect the dots at this point about how the team feels about him. But again, he's struggled very much so on defense. And while PFF's grades, they're not the be-all, end-all by any means. But typically, if a player is playing really well, it's going to reflect that. If a player is playing really poorly, it's going to reflect that as well. And from a special teams grading standpoint, Carpenter is not graded out well in these 2 preseason games. I think he's the 4th worst Packer in terms of special teams grade in the preseason so far. So it's going to be a really important week for him, and it's going to be an important week for Eric Wilson just to continue doing what he's been doing up to this point. Next up, the safety position. Basically, everyone except Darnell Savage. It's an important week for Brian Gutekunst. Was at the podium with us last Friday before the New England game, and when asked about the safety position, said it's really still up in the air. Each player has had their moments, and Matt LaFleur mentioned that as well. After the New England game, he mentioned Anthony Johnson having a few pass breakups, a really nice pass breakup by Jonathan Owens on an RPO that he read really well. Rudy Ford made a nice play near the goal line in run defense where he's able to beat the blocker, get through the gap. Tavarius Moore, made a play behind the line of scrimmage where he was able to slow up the ball carrier, fought through a blocker. So each guy has had their moments, but what's missing is the consistency. As Gutekunst said, nobody has consistently stepped up to seize control of that starting spot next to Darnell Savage. So it's an important week for those guys from a playing time standpoint. Also, when we're looking at roster construction, how many of them are going to make the roster? Add Dallin Leavitt to the mix. Is him, again, kind of in a similar situation as Eric Wilson. He is a veteran on a one-year deal who only can really contribute on special teams. Is that enough for the Packers in a transition year to want to hang on to him? So that's a question that has to be answered. Tavarius Moore left the New England game with a knee injury. We don't know what his availability is going to be this week, if he's going to be able to be on the practice field. But from a playing time standpoint, from a roster construction standpoint, there's a lot still up for grabs at the safety position in determining who's going to end up starting, like I said, and also making the team. One other note on this position, I know on previous roster predictions, I think I had 6 safeties at one point. I had 5 most recently. Again, going back to the most recent roster prediction at Packers Wire, I went with 4. And it's because I went heavy at other positions. I kept the 3rd running back, 7 receivers, 6 edge rushers, 6 interior defensive linemen. But ultimately, my thinking behind that was, look, we have a position here at safety that is one of the weaker positions on the team. So my thought was, instead of rostering an additional safety because there's, unknowns and question marks, I wanted to give that position on the roster to someone who has stood out and someone who has, been one of the best, in my view, 53 players throughout training camp so far. So I think, if I'm guessing, I think the Packers end up keeping 5 of them. But that was my thought process behind it. Instead of trying to keep more guys at a position where nobody's been able to stand out, let's keep the guys who have been playing well. And if we end up a little lighter at that position group, then we end up a little lighter at that position group. All right, lastly, punter. Daniel Whelan, Pat O'Donnell. As I've talked about before, Whelan has a massive leg. If it came down to just that ability, the Packers are going to pick him over Pat O'Donnell. But of course, there's more that goes into it. The big argument that I've made up to this point for keeping O'Donnell is his experience as a holder. That's why the Packers signed him as a free agent a year ago. But Rich Bisaccia has said that Daniel Whelan has very much improved in that area. The Packers are alternating between Whelan and O'Donnell as holders. They're definitely giving Whelan the opportunity to showcase what he can do. There's definitely some risk that comes with relying on a rookie holder, relying on a rookie kicker in a season where points, at least early on, may be at a premium because of a young offense and difficulty just putting points on the board. But again, we go back to what's the state of this Packers roster. Of course, they're still trying to win games, but also an important part of this 2023 season is figuring out who can be my core guys that they can lean on and build around moving forward. And again, punter is its own position compared to the ones on defense and offense that stand out more, but they're trying to find out who their next kicker can be, if Anders Carlson can be that. And perhaps they take a similar approach at punter and are just accepted that they're going to weather the storm that comes with that. Also of note, if the Packers do release Pat O'Donnell, they save $1.55 million in cap space, which for a team that is navigating a difficult salary cap situation, every little bit helps. So like I said, throughout this process I've been pretty adamant in saying relying on a rookie holder, a rookie kicker is too risky. But as more time goes by, I feel like that argument holds or carries less and less weight And I tend to start thinking that I could very well see them going with Daniel Whelan. But either way, Whelan, O'Donnell, it's a big week upcoming for them. All right. That's my guys to watch for. And hey, while we're at it, let's bounce to cornerback real quick. Corey Ballantyne has been out the last week with an injury. I thought that he was pretty well solidified into a roster spot. He had been working with the second team defense all of training camp on the boundary, was a core special teams player in 2022, but he's been injured. So I'm not sure where things stand with him, if it's going to be a long-term injury. Obviously not going to be on the team at that point. Keandre Thomas is someone that I mentioned following the New England game. He put together a really good preseason last year, and this year he's just been steady. I really think he's just a well-rounded player at the cornerback position. He's been solid in coverage. You see him getting off blocks, fighting through blocks. He's a willing and capable tackler. He's someone who's contributing on special teams right now. So if they're going to keep a fifth cornerback, he might be the front runner for that spot right now. I also could see the Packers going with just 4 cornerbacks and waiting for Eric Stokes to come off the PUP list. So that'd be Jair, Rasul, Keyshawn Nixon, and Carrington Valentine. It's definitely going into the season light, but if they expect Eric Stokes to come off after that 4-week period, if he starts the season on the PUP list, perhaps they just try to navigate through those few weeks, bring up a practice squad elevation to get through it at that time. But those are some players to keep your eyes on as well. Corey Ballantyne and then Keandre Thomas potentially fighting for what is currently a 5th roster spot at the cornerback position. If Eric Stokes is activated off PUP before the regular season, so that would have to be in the next week, and he counts towards a 53-man roster, I do not see the Packers keeping a 6th cornerback. I think Ballantyne and Thomas would be released, and Green Bay would probably try to sign both of them back to the practice squad. So now, there you have it. Those are my rundown of players to watch for this week. It's a big week for them. As always, I appreciate you tuning in. Hit like on the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. I greatly appreciate it. You can follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel, and you can find all my work over at Packers Wire. So until next time, friends, take care, stay safe, and as always, go Pack, go.